Okay, so you just finished a lecture on corporate social responsibility and sustainability, and, it's a lot to take in.
It really is.
There's so much history, so many different perspectives, and it's definitely evolved over time. But we thought, why not break it down together right here, right now? So think of this deep dive as your personal cheat sheet for that lecture by Arnav Bhatnagar, Lecture 1, History and Meaning.
Yeah, Arnav's lecture really digs deep into how CSR went from like this side thing to a core part of how businesses operate and how people see them.
Exactly. And we'll make sure to hit those key points, add some extra context where it's helpful, and really try to understand why this whole journey of corporate responsibility matters, especially if you're thinking about, ethical and sustainable product management, which, let's face it, is pretty important these days.
Couldn't agree more. It's not just a buzzword anymore, it's essential.
So first things first, why are companies even making such a big deal about social responsibility these days? It seems like not too long ago, profit was all that mattered.
Yeah, and that's actually a really sharp observation because it points to a huge shift.
Yeah.
Businesses aren't just judged on their, bottom line anymore.
Right.
Their social and environmental impact. That's a make or break factor for how the public sees them and ultimately for their success in the long run.
Like that Patagonia ad, "Don't buy this jacket."
Yeah.
I remember that. It was pretty surprising.
Oh, absolutely. That was a bold statement and a perfect example of a company basically saying, hey, think twice about buying stuff, buy less, and take care of what you have. It really flipped the script on consumerism and forced everyone to think about the environmental costs.
So what's driving this shift? What's pushing companies to care so much about these issues now?
I'd say there are a few major forces at work here. First off, there's way more public awareness now about big issues like climate change, inequality, and even corporate scandals. People are more informed and they're not afraid to speak out, especially online.
Oh, yeah. Social media definitely plays a role in that.
Totally. And then you've got the rise of what's called stakeholder capitalism. This is basically the idea that businesses need to think about everyone they affect: customers, employees, suppliers, communities, not just the shareholders. This idea was really brought to light by people like R. Edward Freeman, and organizations like the World Economic Forum are pushing it hard.
So it's about who a company is responsible to, not just those who own a piece of it.
Right, exactly. And you can't forget about the consumers themselves. Gen Z and millennials, they have high expectations. They want to buy from companies that actually try to make the world better. It's not just about the product, it's about values.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that. I think a lot of people do.
Absolutely. And investors are a big part of this too. More and more investors are using these things called ESG metrics, environmental, social, and governance, when they decide where to put their money. It's not just about the money anymore, it's about how a company treats the planet and its people. If a company isn't doing well in those areas, they might struggle to get funding.
Makes sense. Okay, so before we get too far ahead, let's take a step back. Where did this whole idea of corporate responsibility come from? Like even before it had a name.
Right, let's rewind a bit. Back in the Industrial Revolution, the 18th and 19th centuries, you had incredible economic growth, but often at a pretty steep price. Think about brutal working conditions, pollution from coal everywhere, child labor. It was a very different time.
Not exactly a pretty picture.
Right.
But were there any companies back then who did things differently?
There were some early signs, often tied to religious or philanthropic beliefs. For instance, the Cadbury family in the UK, they were Quakers. They were all about their workers' well-being. They even built houses for them. It was a genuine sense of social responsibility coming from their faith.
Like a company town, but more ethical.
In their case, yeah, that was the idea. You also have examples like the Pullman Company in the US in the late 1800s. They made a whole community for their workers, houses, parks, you name it.
Sounds pretty nice, actually.
Well, on the surface, sure. But they also wanted to, control their workers' lives and prevent things like unions.
Ah, so not entirely altruistic.
Yeah, it was a mixed bag for sure. But this is also when labor unions started becoming a real force, fighting for better conditions, better pay, safety standards. They were a big part of holding companies accountable.
So even without formal CSR, there was pressure on businesses to do better.
Definitely. And companies started realizing that they needed what we call a social license to operate. Basically, acceptance from the community and workers to avoid strikes or bad press. Early CSR, it was more like an informal moral obligation mixed with some practical risk management.
Makes sense. So then let's move into the 1950s. Enter Howard Bowen, often called the father of CSR. What did he bring to the table?
Bowen's book, Social Responsibilities of the Businessman, in 1953, that's kind of the starting point for how we understand CSR today. He asked this crucial question: what responsibilities to society can we really expect businessmen to have?
That's a pretty big question.
It is. And Bowen argued that businesses have a real duty to make sure their actions match up with society's values. This was huge because it started to frame CSR as a part of management's job, not just some personal charity thing.
This was post-World War II, right? So there was a lot of change happening.
Exactly. You had booming economies in the West, but people were also paying more attention to how much power corporations had. There was this growing feeling that companies should give back more to society.
Okay, so Bowen lays the groundwork. What about the next few decades? The 60s, 70s, and 80s were pretty turbulent times, right?
Oh, absolutely. The 60s and 70s, those were turning points. Civil rights movement, anti-war protests, all this social unrest, it definitely affected how people saw corporations.
And the environmental movement really picked up steam during those years, too.
Big time. You have Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, 1962, a landmark book about the dangers of pesticides that really woke people up to the environmental crisis. And globally, there were movements like India's Chipko movement, where people literally hugged trees to protect them from being cut down. Really powerful imagery.
Yeah, I remember learning about that.
So you've got this rising environmental awareness leading to things like the first Earth Day in 1970 and the creation of the EPA in the U.S. It was clear that people wanted businesses to take responsibility for their impact on the planet.
And consumer protection became a bigger deal, too, right?
For sure. Think about Ralph Nader and his book, Unsafe at Any Speed, exposing the car industry for making dangerous vehicles. That led to some big changes in car safety laws. So companies were facing pressure from all sides: social justice, the environment, consumer rights.
It was a lot to handle. But wasn't there also pushback against this idea of social responsibility? Didn't Milton Friedman have something to say about it?
He did. In 1970, he wrote this famous article arguing that a company's only responsibility is to make money for its shareholders. That sparked a huge debate about what a company's real purpose should be, and that debate is still going on today.
Two very different views on what a corporation should be. So how did companies deal with this?
That's where Archie Carroll comes in. In 1979, he proposed this CSR pyramid with 4 levels: economic, legal, ethical, and philanthropic.
So profit was still the foundation then?
Right. A business has to be profitable. That's the base. Then above that, there's the legal level, following the law, and then ethical, doing what's right, even if it's not required by law. And at the very top, you have philanthropic, being a good corporate citizen, giving back to the community.
That pyramid really helps to organize those ideas.
Yeah, it did. Carroll's model became super influential, and it helped companies see CSR as something with different parts that they could actually work on. And overall, we see CSR going from something companies did voluntarily to something with actual legal and ethical expectations.
Okay, so from informal ideas to a more formal framework. Now let's fast forward to today, the 1990s and beyond. What about this whole ESG thing we hear so much about?
Right. So in the 90s, people started talking about the business case for CSR. John Elkington, he came up with the triple bottom line: people, planet, profit. He said companies should be measured on all 3, not just profit.
So there are more bottom lines to consider now.
Exactly. And with globalization in full swing, new problems came up. Think about supply chains, like when people found out about sweatshop conditions in Nike factories. That kind of stuff really forced companies to think about CSR on a global scale.
Makes sense. So that leads to more focus on ESG.
It does. Investors and regulators started demanding more concrete action on environmental and social issues, and that's how CSR evolved into this more formal ESG framework in the 2000s and 2010s. And you had these big international guidelines for responsible business conduct popping up, like the UN Global Compact in 2000 and ISO 26000 in 2010. Those gave companies some real tools to integrate CSR into what they do.
So CSR isn't some separate program anymore. It's becoming part of the core of how businesses operate.
Right. It's all tied up with risk management, brand building, and achieving those big sustainability goals.
And it seems like today, CSR isn't just about avoiding bad stuff. It's about making a positive impact.
Absolutely. It's strategic. Companies are baking social and environmental considerations into everything they do. Think about investments in renewable energy, fair labor practices all along the supply chain, even the ethical side of developing artificial intelligence.
So can you give us some concrete examples of companies that are using CSR strategically?
Sure. Take Microsoft, for instance. They're all about responsible AI, making sure their AI systems are fair, transparent, and accountable. This not only builds trust in their products, but also positions them as a leader in ethical tech. They've also made some serious commitments to be carbon negative by 2030 and remove all their historical carbon emissions by 2050. That's a huge part of their brand image and how they attract customers and talent in a world worried about climate change.
That's ambitious. What about other industries?
Well, IKEA positions itself as this affordable, sustainable lifestyle brand. And they plan to be totally circular by 2030, which means recycling, making products last longer, even offering furniture buyback programs. That sustainability focus is a core part of their identity and appeals to their customer base.
And of course, there's Patagonia, who we mentioned earlier.
Right. Patagonia is practically built on environmental activism. They give 1% of their sales to environmental causes, use sustainable materials whenever possible, and their whole brand image is about being responsible. That resonates with their customers who share those values. So these companies, CSR isn't just something extra they do, it's how they compete and create value in the long term.
It sounds like CSR went from a nice to have to a need to have for any company that wants to succeed.
Exactly. It's part of daily decisions, and it's crucial for building brand loyalty, attracting talent, and achieving sustainable success.
So what are the main areas that modern CSR focuses on?
There's a big push for environmental sustainability, of course. Transitioning to renewable energy, setting net zero targets, adopting circular economy principles like Apple's goal to be completely carbon neutral by 2030. Then there's diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI. Companies are working on closing the gender pay gap, creating inclusive workplaces. Microsoft is a good example of that. And fair labor and human rights are huge. Things like making sure supply chains are ethical, cracking down on modern slavery. Nestlé's cocoa plan, for example, is trying to tackle child labor in the cocoa industry.
And with all the technology we use, data privacy and digital ethics must be pretty big too.
Absolutely. Responsible AI, data protection, following rules like GDPR, adhering to principles like Google's AI principles, these are all essential for CSR in the digital age. And of course, community engagement and philanthropy are still important. Companies are getting involved in their communities, partnering with charities, like what Starbucks is doing with its community stores. The big takeaway here is that CSR isn't just about being good, it's also about being smart and competitive.
Makes sense. But do all these CSR efforts actually make a difference for businesses?
Research shows that they do. Studies show that consumers are more likely to buy from brands they see as responsible. And employees, especially younger ones, want to work for companies with strong CSR values. Plus, investors are pouring money into companies with good ESG performance. And let's not forget, good CSR can also help companies avoid scandals and damage to their reputation.
But we also hear about greenwashing. What's that all about?
Right. Greenwashing is when companies try to look more environmentally friendly than they really are. They make false claims or exaggerate their efforts. Remember the Volkswagen scandal with the emissions cheating? They were promoting their cars as clean while breaking the rules. And then you have things like H&M's Conscious Collection, which has been criticized for not being as sustainable as they claim.
So basically, fake CSR can backfire pretty badly.
Absolutely. Real, impactful CSR builds trust and can actually boost profits. But if it's not genuine, it can really hurt a company's image.
So looking ahead, what are some of the big trends that will shape CSR in the future?
Well, technology is going to be even more important. We're already seeing companies use AI and big data to make their supply chains more sustainable and transparent, track their carbon footprints, and even predict ESG risks. AI can also help address ethical concerns in technology itself, like Microsoft's work on mitigating bias in AI algorithms.
And what about reporting standards and regulations?
ESG reporting is becoming more standardized, and in many places, it's becoming mandatory. The EU's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, or CSRD, that's going to make a lot more companies disclose their sustainability data. Investors are also pushing for more transparency and consistency in ESG reporting, and globally, the amount of money going into ESG funds is skyrocketing.
Sounds like there's going to be a lot more scrutiny on companies.
For sure. And there's also a growing focus on digital ethics, data privacy, AI transparency, digital well-being. New regulations like the EU AI Act are starting to categorize AI systems based on their risk level, which will have a big impact on how companies develop and use AI.
And you mentioned the purpose economy and how younger generations are driving change.
Right. Millennials and Gen Z, they're really pushing brands to stand for something more than just profit. They want to support companies that align with their values, fighting climate change, supporting human rights, promoting equity. For companies to win them over, having a clear purpose beyond just making money is going to be essential.
So as we can see, what started as, like, charity projects has turned into this really complex, essential part of business today. From those old-school industrialists to today's global companies, the way we see and handle corporate responsibility has changed a lot.
Definitely. And this whole journey from CSR to ESG shows that we've fundamentally changed how we think about the role of companies in society. It's not just about the products they sell anymore, it's about their impact on the world. Understanding all this is so important for anyone involved in business, especially in areas like product management.
We hope this deep dive has been a helpful recap of your lecture and has given you some things to think about. One big question to consider. Are companies really more committed to CSR these days, or are they just trying to look good? It's a tough question with no easy answers, and it's something that's going to keep shaping the business world. Keep thinking about these ideas and think about the impact of CSR in your own work and even as a consumer.